There's something deeply disorienting about realizing you disappeared inside your own faith. You didn't mean to. You were just trying to do the right thing, to be obedient, to please God, to be humble. So you started making yourself smaller. In conversations, in decisions, even in the way you prayed, you held back opinions, silenced your instincts, and stopped asking questions that once burned inside of you. You told yourself it was maturity. You told yourself it was spiritual growth. You told yourself it was surrender. But deep down, something in you started to fade. Not your love for God. That was real. But your sense of self. The person God formed with intention and love began to vanish under layers of religious performance and fear-driven obedience. And here's the hardest part to admit. It didn't feel wrong at the time. It felt holy. It felt like what you were supposed to do. You thought, if I deny myself enough, God will accept me more. No one said the words out loud, but the message was everywhere. Be less of you. Feel less. Speak less. Take up less space. Don't be too emotional. Don't question too much. Don't stand out. Don't need anything. Don't want too much. So you adjusted. You got quieter in rooms that needed your voice. You swallowed grief instead of processing it. You ignored your needs and called it faith. But God never asked for that version of you. He never asked you to cancel your humanity to earn His attention. Yet that's what many of us were taught, directly or indirectly, that being close to God required some level of self-erasure. That obedience meant abandoning our personality, our intuition, our dreams. That true spirituality was self-denial so extreme, it bordered on emotional starvation. You stopped dreaming because you feared it was pride. You stopped setting boundaries because you feared it was rebellion. You stopped being honest with yourself because you were told your heart was deceptive. So you began to exist in a strange spiritual in-between. Present, but not fully there. Functional, but numb. Obedient, but anxious. You smiled when you were praised for being humble, but inside, you felt invisible. You weren't becoming more like Christ. You were just becoming less like you. And somewhere along the way, you started confusing silence with surrender. You started confusing disappearance with devotion, and you convinced yourself that the less I am, the more God is pleased. But that's not the gospel. That's spiritual self-abandonment. And it's quietly killing people who deeply love God but don't know how to love themselves without guilt. You were not created to dissolve in the name of obedience. You were not designed to disappear behind theology. You were crafted, intentionally, beautifully, by a God who doesn't need you to shrink to stay holy. Let that sink in for a second. God's holiness is not threatened by your humanity. Your ideas, your voice, your story, they're not obstacles to His will. They're part of why He called you in the first place. But when you've spent years believing that being spiritual means being silent, it's hard to even recognize yourself anymore. You start doubting your gut instinct. You second-guess your own emotions. You downplay your achievements. You question whether your desires are distractions or divine. Because somewhere in your formation, someone convinced you that you were the problem, and the only way to be close to God was to get out of His way. But how can you be in relationship with a God you're constantly trying to hide yourself from? It doesn't work. Not because you're broken, but because God never asked for that trade. He never said, "Give me your personality, and I'll give you purpose." He never said, "Cancel your uniqueness, and I'll call it humility." He never said, "Erase your heart, and I'll use your hands." He said, "Come to me, all of you, the whole you, the full you, the real you." And if you've never been told this before, let me say it clearly. God doesn't want your cancellation. He wants your connection. not the version of you that pleases people, not the version that performs to be accepted, not the version that's spiritually safe, but emotionally starving. He wants the real you, because that's the one he made. And if the church or your past or your own misunderstanding led you to believe that your disappearance is what makes you holy, then you've been carrying a lie in the name of loyalty. But you can put it down now. You don't need to shrink to be sacred. You don't need to disappear to be anointed. The most obedient version of you is not the smallest. It's the most authentic. Because real obedience doesn't ask you to cancel who you are. It asks you to offer who you are, willingly, honestly, fully. And offering who you are means first reclaiming what fear told you to hide. That's what we're going to explore next. How what we called humility was often fear of rejection, and how God never needed you to vanish to call you His. It's easy to confuse humility with self-erasure, especially when you've been praised for shrinking. Especially when every time you put your needs aside, you were called faithful. When every time you stayed quiet, you were told you were wise. When every time you let others decide for you, they said you were spiritually mature. And eventually, you started believing it. That being humble meant being empty. That being obedient meant being voiceless. That being spiritual meant being invisible. But that's not humility. That's fear, dressed up as surrender, and fear is clever. It doesn't always come as panic. Sometimes it comes as passivity, as overcompliance, as a quiet resignation that says, maybe I'm not supposed to matter here. So you played small. You apologized for having needs. You withheld your opinion to avoid conflict. You stopped dreaming because it felt selfish. You let others tell your story because you didn't want to seem prideful for telling your own. And in church spaces, this was often called dying to self. But what you were really doing was disappearing from yourself. Because what no one explained is that dying to self in Scripture never meant denying your personhood. It meant surrendering ego, not erasing identity. It meant releasing control, not abandoning your voice. It meant yielding pride, not forfeiting your boundaries. But you gave it all up because you thought that's what God wanted. You thought being unsure of yourself was a sign of humility. You thought being passive in relationships meant you were being a peacemaker. You thought disappearing in group settings was holy. You thought being low was the only way to be lifted up. And no one corrected you, because quiet compliance looks a lot like holiness from the outside. But it's not holiness if it's rooted in fear, and it's not humility if it costs you yourself. Somewhere along the way, humility was weaponized. It became a tool to keep people silent, agreeable, manageable. And those who complied? They were called spiritually mature. But the truth is, many of them were just afraid. Afraid of being seen as prideful. Afraid of being misunderstood. Afraid of being told they were too much. Afraid that if they ever really showed up, fully, loudly, honestly, they'd be rejected. So they chose invisibility and called it obedience. But obedience without presence is not surrender, it's survival. And God didn't call you to survive Him. He called you to walk with Him as you are, not as you've been conditioned to perform. That kind of walk requires a different kind of humility, a deeper one. Not the false humility that says, I'm nothing, but the sacred humility that says, I am who I am, and I place all of it in His hands. True humility isn't the absence of self, it's the alignment of self under love. It says, I know my voice, and I know when to use it. I know my worth, and I don't need to compete to prove it. I know my place, not beneath everyone, but in relationship with everyone as an equal child of God. Jesus modeled that kind of humility. He washed feet, but also flipped tables. He listened deeply, but also confronted boldly. He withdrew to pray, but showed up fully present when it was time to speak. He never silenced his identity to be spiritual. He embodied it. And that's your invitation too, to stop canceling the parts of you that were meant to carry the image of God, not be crushed by it. Because when you confuse fear with humility, you start rejecting the very gifts God gave you. You start mistrusting your own intuition. You silence wisdom that's been refined through pain. You ignore the voice within you that says, "You deserve to be heard." And this has consequences. Because a person who is always trying to seem small will eventually forget they were ever made to shine. You lose confidence, you lose clarity. You lose connection, not only with others, but with yourself. And most heartbreakingly, you start to believe that God prefers you this way. Muted, controlled, edited. But God never asked you to be manageable. He asked you to be real. And being real sometimes looks like saying, "This isn't okay." Sometimes it looks like saying no. Sometimes it looks like expressing anger without apologizing for your humanity. Sometimes it looks like speaking up in a room that only ever applauded your silence. Because humility is not about shrinking, it's about standing with full awareness of who you are and who God is, and knowing that both truths can exist in the same room without shame. You were not created to vanish. You were created to reflect the Creator. And reflection doesn't happen in darkness. It happens in the light, in honesty, in fullness, in presence. So if you've spent your whole life thinking that God wanted your obedience more than your existence, you've been loving Him through the lens of fear. But it's not too late to love Him through the lens of freedom. And that freedom begins when you start listening to the voice inside that you've been taught to ignore. Because maybe, just maybe, that voice isn't rebellion. Maybe it's the part of you that still remembers what it feels like to be whole. And that's what we explore next. How that silenced voice isn't a threat to your faith. It's the path to the kind of healing obedience that begins with knowing who you really are. There's a voice inside you that you've been taught to fear, not because it was sinful, not because it was deceptive, but because it was yours. Because it didn't sound like the voices you were taught to obey. Because it didn't fit inside the structure that told you who you had to be to stay holy. So you shut it down. Whenever it rose up with conviction, you labeled it pride. Whenever it questioned what didn't feel right, you called it rebellion. Whenever it asked for rest, or space, or expression, you told it to be quiet. You told it that obedience meant not listening to yourself. And after enough time, that voice went quiet. Not gone, just buried. But buried things don't stay buried forever. Especially when they were never meant to die, because what you silenced wasn't your sin. It was your sensitivity. It was your discernment. It was your true self, trying to breathe under the weight of a version of faith that only had room for control. And now, maybe for the first time, you're starting to feel that voice again. Not loud, not demanding, but present. It whispers when you pretend to be okay, and you're not. It nudges when you're about to say yes, but your soul screams no. It lingers when you've just prayed a perfect prayer, but feel disconnected and numb inside. That voice is not your enemy. It's the part of you that still remembers who you were before shame taught you to hide. It's the child in you that wasn't afraid to ask. The dreamer in you that imagined more. The woman or man in you that knew there was power in your softness, your instincts, your truth. But for years, you were told that this voice was dangerous, that it would lead you astray, that it was the flesh trying to deceive you. So you buried it beneath religious effort and called it sanctification. But what if you buried something sacred? What if the voice you silenced was the very one God was waiting to speak through? Because obedience doesn't mean muting yourself. It means being aligned with truth, even when that truth makes others uncomfortable. Think of the prophets. Think of the psalmists. Think of Jesus himself. None of them were quiet for the sake of pleasing people. None of them withheld emotion to appear more spiritual. None of them confused stillness with silence, or peace with passivity. They felt, they spoke, they wrestled, they expressed grief, anger, longing, joy. They trusted the voice within them that God had formed. And it's time for you to do the same. Because the voice inside you, the one you silenced to fit into systems that demanded your compliance, may actually be the path back to yourself and back to God. Here's the paradox. You thought that by silencing that voice, you were becoming more spiritual. But the more you ignored it, the more disconnected you felt. Disconnected from your own heart. Disconnected from people you used to feel close to. Disconnected from God, even while doing everything right. Because there's a kind of spiritual disconnection that doesn't come from sin. It comes from self-betrayal. When you consistently override what's true inside you, your conscience, your emotions, your limits, in order to meet the expectations of others, you begin to feel numb. That numbness isn't failure. It's a signal. It's your soul saying, I can't find you anymore. It's your body saying, I'm tired of pretending we're okay. It's the spirit whispering, let's rebuild from what's real. And rebuilding means listening again. Not to every fleeting feeling, not to every impulse, but to the deep, steady voice beneath the fear. The one that says, you were made for more than this. You don't have to earn your right to exist. It's okay to take up space. It's safe now to tell the truth. Sometimes this voice comes out in emotion, crying for no reason after years of holding it in. Sometimes it comes through restlessness, the discomfort of being in places where you once felt at home, but now feel erased. Sometimes it returns in dreams you thought you had laid to rest. A desire to write, to lead, to speak, to move, to create, to feel alive again. And that's not rebellion. That's resurrection, the resurrection of a self you thought you had to cancel in order to be holy. But God never asked for your cancellation. He asked for your consecration. And those are not the same. Consecration says, I bring my whole self to you, not to be destroyed, but to be refined. It's offering, not erasing. It's surrender, not suppression. Because when God asks for your life, He's not asking you to hate who you are. He's asking you to trust that who you are is safe with Him. Even the parts you were told to hide, even the desires you were taught to fear, even the voice you silenced because someone else couldn't understand it. Those parts are not obstacles to your calling. They're often evidence of it. And once you start listening again, really listening, you'll hear what fear tried to drown out for years. You're not too much. You're not too broken. You're not disqualified. You're not behind. You're just ready now to show up fully, freely, faithfully. And that's what we'll explore next. How to stop hiding behind obedience and start revealing yourself in relationship with God, with others, and with the world that's been waiting to meet the real you. You've spent so long hiding behind obedience that you forgot what it feels like to be seen. You knew the right words. You did the right things. You said yes when you wanted to say no. You stayed silent when your spirit was screaming. And you did it all in the name of God. But obedience isn't supposed to be a hiding place. It's supposed to be a bridge, not a mask. The goal of obedience was never to lose yourself. It was to reveal who you truly are through your relationship with the one who made you. But somewhere in your formation, you were told that obedience meant suppressing your voice, ignoring your instincts, and avoiding any emotion that wasn't safe. You were told to sit still, to calm down, to agree, even when something in your spirit said, "This isn't right." You were trained not in love, but in spiritual compliance. And the problem with compliance is that it looks like holiness, but it leaves you hollow. Because you weren't created to obey like a machine, you were created to respond like a soul. A soul that is alive, present, thinking, feeling, fully engaged. A soul that questions, that wrestles, that listens deeply. A soul that brings its full humanity into the presence of God and doesn't feel the need to apologize for existing. But religion often rewarded what looked like obedience, even when it was actually just disconnection. You learned to obey while emotionally numb, to follow rules without being present, to say yes to God while secretly afraid of what He might say back, because to be fully present felt dangerous. What if He didn't like what He saw? What if others rejected the unfiltered version of you? What if your thoughts weren't holy enough, your emotions too raw, your story too complex? So you edited yourself in worship, in prayer, in community. But God never asked for an edited version of you. He asked for you, all of you, the loud parts, the scared parts, the curious parts, the tired parts, the joyful, angry, vulnerable, radiant parts. He didn't create you to be a hollow servant. He called you to be a whole child. A child who doesn't have to perform for affection. A child who is safe enough to show up messy. A child who is trusted enough to grow in relationship, not just rule following. And when you realize that, when you really believe it, something begins to shift. You stop asking, "What am I allowed to say to God?" And you start asking, "What's real in me right now?" Because that's where intimacy begins, not in perfect behavior, but in honest presence. And honest presence is how you start to reveal yourself in God, not hide behind Him. It's when you start telling the truth in prayer again, not the spiritualized version, the raw version. "God, I'm angry. I don't trust you right now. I feel lost. I'm not okay, and I don't know how to fix it." You might think that kind of honesty is rebellion, but it's actually a sign of closeness, because you don't speak like that with someone you're afraid of. You speak like that with someone you trust enough to stay. And God stays. Not because you're cleaned up, not because you've perfectly behaved, but because He is committed to your presence, even when you aren't sure you're committed to His. That's what love does. It doesn't flinch when the truth shows up. It embraces it. And when you allow yourself to be that real with God, something else happens. You begin to be that real with others too. You stop living behind spiritual masks. You stop playing roles in relationships. You stop adjusting your entire personality to make other people feel comfortable. You start living in your body again. You start making eye contact. You start breathing without guilt again. And it's not that you're louder or bolder, it's that you're finally present. You stop walking into rooms wondering who they want you to be. You walk in asking, "How can I be fully here and fully honest at the same time?" And here's the beautiful paradox. The more you show up in God, the more peace you bring to others. Not because you're flawless, but because your presence carries safety, A person who is no longer afraid of their own voice becomes a refuge for people who are still finding theirs. You become the kind of person who doesn't need to fix everyone. You just need to be with them. Because now you understand that love doesn't require control. It requires connection. And connection begins with presence, not perfection. You no longer equate obedience with silence. You now understand that true obedience is full-bodied. It includes your heart, your mind, your emotion, your agency, your voice, and it includes saying to God, "Here I am, not who I think I'm supposed to be, just me, and I trust you to receive me as I am, not as I've performed." That kind of relationship is slow, tender, rooted, but it's real. And it begins when you decide you no longer have to disappear to be accepted, because now you know God doesn't want your perfection. He wants your presence. And the people around you? They don't need your obedience as performance. They need your honesty. So what does it look like to live that way? To be fully you, not just spiritually, but emotionally and relationally? That's where we go next, into the practical reintegration of identity and faith, where obedience isn't about disappearing, but about becoming more deeply, beautifully yourself, in Him. Now that you've started to remember who you are, now that the masks have slipped, and the silence has cracked, and the voice within you is no longer something you fear, what happens next? How do you live from this new place, where obedience isn't about disappearing, but about revealing who you were all along? You begin to rebuild, but this time, you don't rebuild from fear. You don't rebuild to please. You rebuild from love, from clarity, from truth. And truth always begins with identity, not the one you borrowed, not the one you were told to perform, not the one shaped by guilt or trauma or expectations, the one that was written over your life before fear taught you how to hide. That identity doesn't cancel your personality. It grounds it. It doesn't reject your emotion. It teaches you how to hold it with God. It doesn't demand silence. It gives your voice purpose. You don't obey God to become someone else. You obey because you've come home to who you are in Him. And home is where the pressure breaks. You stop obsessing over being used by God and start wondering what it means to walk with Him. You stop spiritualizing your burnout and start respecting your human limits. You stop equating your value with your usefulness and start remembering that being fully present is already holy. This is the new rhythm, a faith where you can still be wildly devoted to God without abandoning yourself to prove it. It's not flashy. It won't always look radical by performance standards, but it will feel like peace. You wake up in the morning, and the first question isn't, "Am I doing enough for God?" It's, "Am I staying close to what's real in me, and am I bringing that to Him?" Because when obedience is rooted in identity, it looks like this. You honor your boundaries. You say no when you used to overextend. You speak truth even when your voice shakes. You rest when you used to strive. You create. You grieve. You rejoice. You love from overflow, not obligation. And this doesn't make you less spiritual. It makes you alive, because obedience that flows from identity carries power. It's not reactive. It's responsive. It's not desperate. It's secure. It's not rushed. It's grounded. It listens to God in real time, not through fear of missing out on a calling, but through a daily awareness. I am already called. I am already chosen. I am already loved. And I don't have to cancel myself to walk with Him. You stop shrinking in rooms that once made you feel too loud. You stop apologizing for your sensitivity, your creativity, your insight. You stop filtering your emotions through a lens of suspicion. You understand that Jesus didn't come to manage you. He came to free you. Free from fear disguised as reverence. Free from performance dressed up as faithfulness. Free from obedience rooted in insecurity. Now you can serve without disappearing. Now you can lead without pretending. Now you can pray without filtering. Now you can trust without bracing. You can look in the mirror and say, "This is who I am. This is who He sees. And I don't have to become less to be loved more." And the deeper you live into that truth, the more you realize your presence is sacred. Not because you're flawless, but because you're whole. And wholeness changes everything. It changes how you show up in relationships. You don't need to prove your goodness anymore. You don't need to disappear to keep the peace. You don't need to betray yourself to avoid discomfort. You speak gently, not because you're afraid, but because you're at rest. You stay silent when needed, but no longer because you're ashamed. You're simply secure. You forgive yourself quicker, knowing that God never asked you to be perfect, just present. And here's what's wild. People will notice. Your presence will start doing what your performance never could. It will soften room. It will invite truth. It will disarm shame. Because a person who is no longer afraid to exist is a person who gives others permission to exist too. You become light. Not the blinding kind, but the steady kind. The kind that says, "You're allowed to be here, as you are." And suddenly, obedience becomes sacred again. Not as a tool of suppression, but as a response to love. Not as something that erases you, but as something that reveals God through you, the real you, because that's all He ever wanted. Not your performance, not your perfection, just your truth, just your heart, just your presence. So if you've spent years thinking you had to cancel yourself to follow Him, if you believed obedience meant erasure, if you've tried to be holy by being less human, let this be your reminder. God never asked you to disappear. He asked you to walk with Him fully, freely, faithfully, as yourself. And now that you've found that, you won't go back to shrinking. You'll keep showing up, day by day, truth by truth, step by step. Because obedience, when rooted in identity, isn't heavy, it's liberating. And this is what it means to follow Him, not by canceling yourself, but by becoming, finally, whole.